All right, now we're recording. Hi, Jaggy. Love it. All right, well, let's jump right in. John, welcome to the show. Um,
Thank you. It's great to be
yeah,
with you, Stacy.
yeah, this has been months in the making. I've been very excited about this ever since I reached out. When I first reached out, I one of the things I mentioned was that uh, frequently when people ask me where I got my sort of way of looking at corporations and my concern about what's going on, how I got my perspective on that, I'll often really the book that I recommend is this is a good place to start is to look at Confessions of an Economic Hitman. I've recommended that probably at least a dozen times to people over the years. And I think I've been through it four or five times myself now. And I have the audio so I can, plug it in. Since then though, I've listened to Touching the Jaguar. And for me, that filled out so much more of the story. Not just, what was touched on in Confessions, but also really your journey. And I gotta say, economists are supposed to be really dry writers. But like I read your book and you're a tremendous writer. It takes us every each of your books I've read has taken me on this lovely journey. You're a tremendous writer. I just wanted to pause and appreciate that before we even move forward.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I think that's what distinguishes it. I was originally going to be a writer. I was an English major, and I ended up studying business administration primarily as a way to get a draft deferment, and one thing led to another. Um, but I love to write. It's my favorite thing, and I have a list of many well-known people like Joe Stiglitz, who was a chief economist at the World Bank and won the Nobel Prize in economics, and many others who write very similar things to me, say the same sorts of things. Like Stiglitz says the World Bank policy, the economic models they used were made to justify their policies, not the other way around as they presented to determine their policies. And there's many others who write the same kind of stuff, but it's very dry because most of them write, for academics and they're read by academics. But I love to tell stories, and I also think not too many others actually have the personal stories. So it's fun to it's fun to relive those, and I really enjoy it.
Yeah, it's really a beautiful read, both books, and I'm looking forward to diving into some of your other stuff now, especially since so much was opened up for me and Touching the Jaguar about the other work that you're doing around Dream Change and Pachamama Alliance, which we'll definitely get into in this call as well. Before we dive into it too much, to kind of give the listeners who may not have deep understanding of what your background is, maybe give a little bit of maybe we can jump off with the idea of the difference between the death economy and the life economy. Maybe that's a good place to enter into it.
Yeah, well, the death economy was really something I helped to promote. My real title was chief economist at a major international consulting firm. But what my job was to create what now we can call a death economy, which is an economic system that's based heavily on resource extraction and domination of resources by certain countries, in my case, the United States. And it's based on a goal of maximizing short-term materialistic consumption and maximizing short-term profits, regardless of the social and environmental costs. It's really created a degenerative economic system that's driving us frankly, toward self-destruction. It's polluting and consuming itself toward destruction. And the alternative is what we call a life economy, which is based on a goal of making short-term profits, because corporations have to do that, but not necessarily maximizing them. Instead, maximizing long-term benefits for all life. And it creates, pays people well to do jobs like cleaning up the environment, figuring out technologies that'll corral all the plastic floating around in the ocean and recycle it, and filling in old mine pits and restoring forests and rivers and so on and so forth, and coming up with new technologies like solar and wind, which we've already come a long way with, but we've got a lot further we can go, and we can create new sources of energy out of the air, out of water. We know that those technologies are out there. So, so this is an economic system that isn't meant to put us back living in caves. It's meant to create a better life for all of us, and and give us jobs that really make the world a better place that our children and grandchildren and great grandchildren will thank us for.
It's a big turn from, looking at how the U.S. has operated up until now, corporations in particular. There was a statistic you shared in your book. I don't remember the exact number, but it was the percentage of population we have in the U.S. versus the amount of the world's resources that we consume, and it's something like 7% versus 20%, something like that.
Yeah,
Um,
we do, yeah, we consume over 20% of the world's resources, and we're, like less than 400 million people in a population of almost 8 billion.
yeah,
You can figure the percentage. But it's also interesting that China, which has a much larger population, and we are the two largest producers of pollution, and also the two largest, almost 50% of the world's global gross domestic product comes from our two countries. So we really have this tremendous responsibility. And China produces more pollution than we do, but on a per capita basis, it's much, much less because their population is so much larger.
yeah. It's that's the thing we need to change, right? We've had these. What I'm thinking about is your journey from being, what's known as an economic hitman, or what you call an economic hitman. For those who don't understand what that is, that's, people go into these countries and sometimes lay the groundwork decades before to be able to cheat countries out of their resources, and this, of course, feeds the U.S. corporate mindset and bottom line, and the U.S. government gets involved sometimes, and we've seen this over and over again. And I love how eloquently you write about some of the horrible stuff that came from that. Um, Ultimately, this whole podcast is about the human journey. That's what this show is really about, examining those things. And one of the things that stood out for me about your books is you've had an amazing journey, John, and what you've done to, go through that journey and come out in a position to want to tell a story and make a difference. That's incredibly touching to me, to see someone really leaning into the discomfort of, the things that you've touched that, later on, and it seemed to me to be clear from the very beginning, in the first, when you wrote Confessions, I could see that conflict early on. Like, you went into it thinking, okay, I can maybe change this from the inside. But I think a big piece of that came from your experience in the Amazon. Is that true?
Well, yeah. Now, yeah, so when I got out of college, out of business school, I still had the draft bearing down on me, and I was determined not to go to Vietnam. I did not believe in that war. I did not intend to go off and kill people or be killed by people I didn't have any problem with. And I was still confronted with that, so I joined the Peace Corps, which was potentially draft deferrable, and I did get a draft deferment. Incidentally, I don't know whether you can hear my cat in the background, but if you hear a strange noise in the background, it's she's very talkative.
It's
In
an
any
extra voice. That's nice. It adds a little extra layer to it.
Yeah. In any case, I joined the Peace Corps and was sent deep into the Amazon rainforest, where I spent 3 years in the Peace Corps. I extended a year, and in Ecuador, and um, that really, really shaped me in many ways. And I wanted to do good in the world. And when I was recruited by this consulting firm, the name was Charles T. May. It no longer has that name. It's been bought and sold a couple of times. But it, I was told, well, now you're going to do good things on a really big scale. Because what you're going to do is convince countries to take these huge loans, poor countries, countries with resources we our corporations want, incidentally, like oil. That was a big one back in the 70s. Still is, as we're currently finding out. But So you're going to convince these countries to take huge loans and then hire our corporations, primarily engineering corporations like mine, to build big infrastructure projects, electric power systems, industrial parks, highways, ports, airports, and so on. And everybody's going to be better off. GDP will grow because of these projects, and so will GDP per capita. And GDP per capita, it implies everybody. It's per capita, it's per person, right? And so for the first 7 years that I had that job, I really believed that I was doing good stuff, even though it was pretty obvious to me that in the end, these countries were saddled with debts they couldn't repay. And when these countries couldn't repay their debts, we went back in, usually under the guise of the international monetary system, and International Monetary Fund, and we'd say, so, well, you can't pay your debts, so sell us your collateral, because for the debts we would have collateralized the oil or whatever the resource was. So sell us your oil real cheap to our corporations without environmental and social regulations, or let us build a military base on your soil. Vote with us on the next vote against Cuba or China or whatever. And but I believe that these were smart moves because I believed in what we call neoliberal economics that guide this, because that's what I've been taught, and that's the propaganda that the World Bank puts out, and I was falling for it. And then after about 7 years, the head of state of Panama, Omar Torrijos, who became a friend, took me aside and said, "Hey, John, don't you realize that you're being lied to? You're lying to yourself. And you're lying to the world now because you're not helping the majority of people in most of these countries. You're putting them deep into debt as a result of having to pay the interest on the loans. We're having to divert money from education, healthcare, and other social services that benefit the majority of the people. And in the end, we can't pay off the final loan anyway. So our country suffers, except for a few rich families, and they own the industries. They own the banks, the commercial establishments, so they benefit from more electricity and better highways and better ports and airports. But the majority of the people don't. And I said, well, but what about income per capita? Well, he said, that's just GDP divided by the number of people. But it's a meaningless number because most of the people aren't part of the GDP, really. They're a very, very small part. It's the wealthy people, it's the big industries, and the foreign corporations that contribute to GDP, and they all benefit from these loans and these projects that you're building.
Yeah, the one of the quotes I pulled from the book, this was from Touching the Jaguar. Economic hitmen, EHMs, are highly paid professionals who cheat countries around the globe out of trillions of dollars. They funnel money from the World Bank, U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, and other foreign aid organizations into the coffers of huge corporations in the pockets of a few wealthy families who control the planet's natural resources. That pretty much summarizes what you said. It's interesting too that book was written in 20 was published in 2020, but you were already touching on USAID, and though USAID they definitely have some good stuff they do. It is interesting how much criminal activity is going on there as well. Um,
Well,
that was one of those that stood out.
they changed a lot and got better before Trump did away with them. In my time, which was in the 70s, their primary goal, and that of the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank and all those other organizations, was to fight communism, to make sure that our system excelled over the communist system. And so it was really to support big international corporations and U.S. foreign policy. That has changed when the Soviet Union ended in 91. Um, Things began to change, and to some degree, they got better. And then the Chinese evolved, and today the Chinese dominate world trade hugely. My most recent book, published so far, is about China's economic hitman. China went from, what happened was in the year 2000, the United States was the number one trading partner with 80% of the world's countries. By 2023, that had completely reversed. China became the number one trading partner in 70% of the world's countries. And so, they dominated. It's not will they dominate? No, they do dominate. They're dominating right now. And that has forced our institutions to also change somewhat to compete better with the Chinese banks and the Chinese development companies and organizations.
Yeah, believe that the Chinese situation grew out of I think it was Nixon gave them the most favored nation trading status as a strategy to bring them into the modern world, as he put it, or something. And then that worked pretty well because it changed things over there, but then it created what it's created now. So it's sort of interesting to watch if my memory is working correctly, you probably have a better grasp on that than I do, but it seemed like a good strategy at the time. But then, like so many things, the downstream effect might catch you off guard, right?
No, it was a good strategy. It brought China has brought 900 million people out of dire poverty. That's more than three times the population of the United States, or about three times the population. It had tremendous economic growth, and now it's really fighting hard to get rid of pollution and to dominate the world in EVs and solar and wind. I, you know, I think the problem is that we look at China as an enemy. China's not should not be looked at as an enemy. We can make it an enemy, and we've been doing that, putting it in that position. China's never been a very militaristic country. Yes, it threatens Taiwan, it threatened Hong Kong and Tibet, just as we threaten most of Latin America right now, and the Middle East, with what we're doing. But China primarily has expanded through trade, through commerce. We have military bases in over 100 countries. People resent us for that. China only has two military bases really overseas in Africa, and they're more supply bases than really strong military presence. So it has really excelled. Its economic hitmen learned a lot from us. I taught at a business school in Shanghai a few years back and realized that what these students who were very bright wanted to learn was what mistakes I had made so they wouldn't make the same mistakes and what things I had done right so that they could learn to do that. So China's done a great job, and I don't think we should be upset about that. Bringing 900 million people out of poverty is not something to be upset about. And yes, do they have problems? Do they treat their Uyghur people badly? Yes, but if you talk to Chinese, if you talk to Africans, if you talk to Muslims in many parts of the world, they'll say, well, what's going on with the Uyghurs is nothing compared to what the United States is supporting in Gaza and Afghanistan and Iraq. You are the anti-Muslim nation. Yes, China has a problem with the Uyghurs. That's a bad thing that they're doing. But that's a very small number of people compared to the Muslims that you now in Iran are impacting and hurting. So it's a lot about perspective, Stacy, and we get a very biased perspective here in the United States.
We do, John.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
So
and I'm very patriotic. I come from a family that fought in the American Revolution. But I feel that, we've made mistakes, and I was a big part of that. And the way
Mhm.
that a democracy functions is to recognize its mistakes, to criticize them, and then to correct them, to get better, which is what we really need to do.
At least a democracy with a conscience. Yeah.
Yeah. And I
Yeah.
think we were on the way to that until recently. We were really moving toward solar and wind and electric cars and a consciousness about our environmental and social problems. I have a book coming out in September. It's basically finished now, and it's called The Art of the Steal, Trump and the Economic Hitman Presidency. And it's not a political book. It's not it points out that every president, Democrat and Republican alike, since World War II, during my lifetime, have used economic hitmen. But Trump has brought this out into the open. He's made what was secret explicit and participated personally in it. I think it's easy. He kind of openly makes his family wealthier and wealthier. and does things that seem to go against many of our precedent-setting ways in the past of consulting Congress and so on and so forth. So he's really brought something out into the open that's been there all along. And in writing this book, it was an interesting experience for me because what I'm saying is that his policies are built on what we call the four pillars of the economic hitman strategy that I helped to develop. So it was a difficult book to write because I'm having to, talk about the things that I did that now are being used and that I think in a way is drastically hurting the United States. We are losing our credibility around the world. We're losing our leadership position around the world. And I think that's very unfortunate, especially at this time when we should be competing with China, not as an enemy, but as a very smart, very capable competitor. And when you have good competition, everybody gets better, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's the old playbook. I think for some reason there's this ongoing presence in DC, no matter who the president is, that has a need to have an enemy constantly. I kind of think it's maybe the military-industrial complex behind it, but what do I know? It's unfortunate to watch though because we really should be moving into something better. And actually, I think we are moving into something better. Like all the signs are there and the prophecies are there. And actually, I want to get into that before we're done here. I've got some notes about that. We'll reference a little bit later, but I want to talk a little about your ayahuasca experience because I was dragging you that direction and we got onto another thing. It was fascinating to me to read in confessions when you talked about that. You were very sick. You were in your 20s. You thought you might die, and a shaman came and took care of you, and you had this medicine he gave you, and the next day you felt tremendous. But you also had this amazing connection with him in that moment where he talked about, I guess he had never given the medicine before to, a white American, uh, a Westerner. But there was also a vision he had had that he was going to have a Westerner that he would teach. And he told you about it. That must have been, I think about how that may have informed your journey. It's really a question. It seems to me like that's one of those moments in your 20s that would, okay, it's going to leave a bookmark somewhere in you. And as you're moving forward, I'm curious how often you referred back to that because I know that your journey continued to involve shaman and your interest in shamanism and some of this beautiful cultural messages and prophecies.
Yeah, well, like you said, I thought I was resigned to dying. I was deep, deep in the Amazon rainforest, living with the Shuar people, who, if you've ever seen a shrunken head or a picture of one, they did it. There are other headhunters in the world, but they're the only ones that shrink heads. Anyway, I'm living with these people 1968 to 1971. I was in Ecuador, and most of that time with them. Um, and I don't think that shaman had ever even, well, there was an Italian priest that went through a couple of times a year and performed a few ceremonies. He'd probably seen him, but other than that, it's probably the only non-Ecuadorian he'd ever laid eyes on. And yeah, he'd had this dream that he needed to train somebody in the ways of his traditions because those traditions needed to go out to the world and tell the world about how we needed to change our dream of the modern world. So after I quit being an economic hitman, in the early 80s, I went back to the Shuar, and I said, well, I've done some pretty bad things, and I just realized that. And now your forests are being threatened, and that's part of the economic system I helped to develop. So I want to help you save your forest now. And their shaman said, well, if you want to help us, if you want to save these forests, don't try to change us. We're not destroying the forest. You are. Your oil companies, your lumber companies, your cattle ranchers, they're the what's destroying the forest. But then they said, but those are just symptoms. What's really destroying the forest is your dream, of the dream of the modern world, of accumulating more and more resources, of exploiting the earth, of digging the earth, and of materialistic consumption. So go back and change the dream of your people. And if you have some people there who want to participate and want to become teachers. Bring them here and let them learn from us, but don't try to change us. So I've devoted much of the rest of my life to doing that, and have seen in the process tremendous changes amongst the Shuar and the Achwa and all of the neighboring, what we used to call tribes, which are now recognized as nations within a nation. So it has been an amazing journey and an incredible education in the process.
Let me just jump in there and underline the fact that the amazing things that have happened there in the last 2, 3 decades
Mm.
have been greatly because of your involvement. And it, I'm going to highly recommend everyone read Touching the Jaguar. It's an amazing book. It's also a incredibly reasonable price on Amazon. I'll share a link in the show notes for people. But that book, you had some harrowing moments where you feared for your life, more than one. And you had moments in that book where you were taking people of influence from here in the States who might be able to help achieve some of these dreams of, doing this work and helping the world start to understand and start to shift and change our dream, where, these people were endangered and they were, it was your responsibility to take care of them. And there's a lot of fear and anxiety around that. And that the story you told there was incredible, but in coming back 20 years later and finding that, tribes that are historically warring tribes are now intermarrying and that are now living peacefully with each other, multiple tribes, and now becoming, as you said, a nation versus, individual peoples. They still have their individual tribe identity, but the changes that happened there were greatly because of the efforts that you and people that work with your alliances have done. And I just wanted to thank you for that because these things all start somewhere and they don't start without effort.
Well, I appreciate that, Stacy, but I don't want to take very much credit for that. It's the indigenous people did it. And I brought the word out to the rest of the world in a way through my books. And also we at the Pachamama Alliance, which I'm a co-founder of with Bill and Lynn Twist, uh, we provided money to hire lawyers and pass laws in Ecuador that help make these people uh, more independent, to be nations within nations. And Ecuador is the first country to adopt a constitution that gives inalienable rights to nature as much as to people. It
Mhm.
hasn't always honored those from a practical standpoint, but it has that in the Constitution, which is a good thing. And it's now been put in other constitutions. And we helped finance the lawyers, international lawyers that could make that written in a way so that it would be applicable in Africa and in Asia as well as Latin America. So yeah, we've done some things like that, but the indigenous people themselves are the ones that take the credit because, what they recognized originally, the tribes warred amongst each other, waged war amongst each other, the Achwa against the Shwa. Many times it was clans, one Shwa clan against another Shwa clan. It was all, and what I came to understand was usually that was overpopulation. If a population of one group got to be too big, they were consuming too many resources, they would move into to the area that was considered to be territory of another group. And the other group is also struggling with its growing population. And so the wars would evolve over resources, kind of like what the whole world's been about for so long. Like are we in Iran to get oil? Or or did we go into Venezuela to get oil? We're worried about the Strait of Hormuz because of oil. And that's another story, incidentally. I helped build the military base that's now being used to close down the Strait of Hormuz. Originally, it was a U.S. military base. Now it's Iranian. And but anyway, so these wars over resources, and then the indigenous people began to understand that the real enemy were the oil companies and the cattle ranchers and the lumber companies. And so they understood that they needed to come together to oppose these companies, and what was going on. So clans and tribes that had been enemies for thousands of years joined forces. They united. They created alliances. Very, very effective. And now there's all this intermarriage and so on. Things have changed so radically. in that way. But they really recognize this. Yes, they got a little help from us, and we helped to provide transportation through airplanes or maybe walkie-talkies and two-way shortwave radios that so they could communicate better with other communities. We helped them, but it was always their initiative. We never went in and said, you do this, you do that. We said, what do you need from us? How can we help you carry out your dream? And I think it's really, really important to recognize that they are so in tune with what needs to be done in the world right now, and they don't have the technology to do it because, things have changed in 50 years. Where, used to, when I was a Peace Corps volunteer in the Amazon, I had absolutely no contact with anybody in the outside world. And even when I was in the country's capital, Quito, Ecuador, to make a phone call to my family back in the United States, I had to set up a time and go to a centralized place and sit in a booth. And the phone call went through, and it was often sounded like it was under the ocean, and it
Mhm.
was. And you might get cut off at any moment. It almost wasn't worth it, and very expensive. You know, and this is even when I was an economic hitman in the 70s and going back to Ecuador and going to Indonesia and other places. It's phenomenal what's happened in terms of being able to communicate with each other and transport things around.
It's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
And
It's got a dark side as well as a light side.
for sure. Yeah, there always is that other side of the coin, isn't there? And it doesn't surprise me that you would deflect too much credit for what's happening there, but I can't help but consider what the world would have been like in the U.S. when we had such horrible slaughter of natives here. If there had been someone like John Perkins to go, hey, look, you guys want this thing, we want to help you with it. We're willing to do what's necessary to help you get it. Yeah, there's the willingness there, of course, and of course, they want to do what they can because it's definitely to their benefit. But to have someone with the ability and the will to actually try to help makes a huge difference in the world. And the downstream effect of that, you'll never know because it'll last for generations. And, we'll both be gone by then. But you can deflect all you want, but you're definitely making a difference in the world. And I have a deep appreciation for that, my friend.
Well, thank you. But and again, it's really the important thing is changing the dream of our people. It's really that's what we've got to do, move from the death economy to a life economy.
For all
And
of us.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's ultimately what the Schwa told me when I eventually formed a nonprofit called Dream Change, and then that led to the Pachamama Alliance. They said, you got to go back and convince your people that they have to change their dream, because otherwise, nothing we do here, nothing that you do here in the rainforest, is going to change anything. The only thing that'll change things is to transform the death economy to a life economy. They didn't use those terms, but that's what it amounts to, is that is our challenge today. We have to move away. And, the indigenous people, but they have all their problems that are, they're crazy ones, there are violent ones, there are wife beaters, there are, you know, and there are wonderful ones that as individuals. What I admire about them is this belief that are a part of nature and they have to live within the bounds of nature and cooperate with nature. Whereas we believe that we are apart from nature, we're supreme over nature, we can do whatever we want to nature. And that worked for a long time, but it's now no longer working. We're seeing how destructive that can be. So the important thing for us is to create an economic situation, which I call a life economy, and many economists do today, that brings us back in touch with what it is to be a part of, rather than apart from nature. And, if you think about it, we all come from ancestors that lived that way, lived in a life economy. For most of the 200,000 years we've been human beings, we had life economies. It's only been within the last several thousand years that that's even started to change. And it's been since World War II that's taken a huge leap and bound, and been within the last few decades and even the last few years that we've moved more and more toward the death economy, quite frankly. We were moving away from it, but in the last several years, we've been, especially in the United States, we've been denying this the need to move into a life economy. We've
Yeah.
reverted back to the idea that we need to burn more fossil fuels, that that's a good thing. How can anybody think of that as a good thing?
Yeah, it's interesting to look at the trajectory of it. You know, it used to be back in the day, you would grow extra potatoes so you could stockpile resources, so you'd have safety through the winter. And then, you know, if you can stockpile additional resources, then great. It just kept ramping up, and then the Industrial Revolution happened, and then, you know, the United States now stockpiles resources and consumes resources at a higher rate than anyone, and it's almost like fear drove the whole thing, like fear of not having enough, fear of whatever. And you know, I see as we're moving forward in the world that more and more people are stepping away from being driven by fear, trying to make that effort and trying to get more into nature. I'm certainly one of them, surrounded by plants. You know, I love it. When I'm not in my room surrounded by plants, I'm out in nature. You know, and there's something about that I think the more we dive into the spiritual side of ourselves, the more we realize we are part of nature and we want to be around it. And there is something very, very filling about being out in nature in whatever form that takes. Um,
Yeah, yeah, Stacy, I've had the good fortune of being able to travel around the world speaking at all kinds of events. In the last year, I've spoken at events in Europe, Asia, Latin America, the Middle East, and everywhere I go, I see that people, like you mentioned, are waking up. There's a consciousness revolution that's going on. And at the same time, there's a pushback. The status quo, always when there's a revolution, and this is a consciousness revolution, but always when there's a revolution, the status quo wants to stop it because they think everything's just wonderful. You know, they're getting rich, like, and that they think that that gives them a great life. I don't know too many rich people that I would really want, that I would have any desire at all to change places with. But uh, that they push back. And so we're experiencing that right now, this tremendous pushback on the part of the status, the people who are at the top, the billionaires, at the top, economically speaking. And I think that's a message that we need to take seriously and take energy from. I've been a martial artist most of my life, and I learned a long time ago that if I'm sparring against a guy who's stronger and bigger and stronger than me, I don't try to overpower him. I've got to use his energy against him. And that's what good revolutionaries do. And now that we're in this consciousness revolution, we've got to understand that we've got to use that energy against them. That's why I feel that, that I needed to write a book that talked about how this change in our political system in the United States is based on the economic hitman pillars, the four pillars of the economic hitman strategy, which I helped to develop. So I was thinking, well, what can I do to expose the system that's not working and try to change it? And it's right. That's how I turn that energy around. I love to write. And I think it's important for everybody to understand we all have a role to play in this. And it's different for all of us. You do a podcast. I write. The plumbers have a role to play, and carpenters, and teachers, and students, and everybody. We can look at how do we mold ourselves and our occupations or our interests in life into transforming the death economy to a life economy. We can do what we most enjoy doing in our lives, but do it in a way that aims towards the life economy. And a carpenter can use sustainable materials and plant trees and let his customers know that that's an investment in the future, not a cost. It's a price, maybe, but the price is not a cost, it's an investment in the future. The writer or the podcast host can, really open us all up to understanding the situation we're in and looking at ways that we can turn it around. We
Yes, and
all know.
ultimately, it really is about that mind shift. That changing your dreams, right? It's
Oh,
what you focus on that ends up being the thing. And if we're focusing on, you know, consumption, of course, but there is a change going on. And one of the things I find interesting, and I'm sure you're aware of all these, all the prophecies that have been projected for thousands of years and talked about for thousands of years. In Hindi, they talk about the Kali Yuga, the end of the there's all these yugas, and we're coming to the end of the Kali Yuga, which is like a 400 or 400 and something year cycle. It's all happening within this time period we're in. In the Mayan tradition, they speak of the fifth world or the fifth sun. Again, happening now here at theaters near you, coming today. The Hopi
yes.
traditions talk about the fifth world as well, and the Lakota and Sioux as well have these great prophecies that actually are really close to the prophecies of the eagle and the condor, which I'd love to have you speak on.
Yeah, I think a lot of the prophecies in the Americas grew out of the eagle and the condor. I come from New Hampshire originally, and the Abenaki people who lived there, they have a prophecy that I see echoing that of the eagle and the condor. And that prophecy goes like this. It came out of probably the Amazon and went up into the Andes, perhaps 3,000 years ago. We don't know. It's an oral tradition that came out. But even way back then, they said back in the mists of history, human societies would decide to take two different flights, two different courses. One would be the flight of the condor. Now, the condor is an environmental bird. It cleans up carrion. It eats trash. It doesn't kill anything. It cleans up the environment. And that they said would be be the flight of the people who believe that they are a part of nature, living within nature. And then the other part of society would take the course of the eagle, which is a bird of prey, which swoops down and kills things. And that would be the path of the people who believe that they are superior over nature, that they can ravage nature, that they are apart from nature. And the prophecy said that for thousands of years, these two birds, these two cultures would go in different directions. They wouldn't connect with each other. And then in what's known as the fourth Pachacuti, and in Quechua, the language of the Andes, a Pachacuti is a 500-year period. In the fourth Pachacuti, the eagle and the condor would come together, and they would clash. And the eagle would be so strong as to practically drive the condor into extinction, but not quite.
By
And we
some strange coincidence, that first meeting, based on their prophecy, happened to land right about when Columbus arrived, and the Spaniards came in and started destroying cultures in South America. Coincidence?
You've got it. In Africa too, the colonial powers of Africa, the French and the Dutch and yeah.
And
Exactly.
now we're about
Exactly.
500 years later, right?
Right. And
Which the
500
prophecy has
years
some
later,
things to say about.
yeah, the prophecy says that 500 years later, in the fifth Pachacuti, the eagle and the condor could start to dance together in one sky, mate, and create a new offspring, which was said to be higher consciousness. And so we know that that began to happen about the year 2000. It began, and there's the specific date isn't important. It's a period of time a Pachacudi takes to move from one to the other. It doesn't happen in one day. It moves through.
Mhm.
And so, we know that like in the 1990s is when people started in the United States reading books about shamanism. And that's when I published books about shamanism, five of them back before I did Confessions of an Economic Hitman. I had five books on that. And the shamans began to really understand that they wanted to share their knowledge. They wanted to bring it up. The one I'd worked with in the late 60s was a real exception to that. He saw that coming way back then, but it really took hold in the 1990s and has continued. And so we see this prophecy manifesting. But it's very interesting that it's always been said that the prophecy doesn't just happen. We have to make it happen. We, the people, the condor people and the eagle people, need to come together and make this happen and set policies and actions that make it happen. It starts with the perception. And when we know that when we change a perception, we change our actions. When we change our actions, we change reality. So everything is driven by perception. And if you have a perception that the way to make the world a better place, the perception I had when I was an economic hitman is to ravage the earth, exploit other countries, and create a death economy, that takes you to one reality, which is where we've been going. But if you change that perception to say, no, we want to be a part of nature, we don't want to ravage the earth, we want to recycle it, we want to create cyclical economies, we want to create a life economy. If we really buy into that perception, we change our actions. And when we change those actions, we will change our reality.
Yeah, indeed. And I find it fascinating, though, that all these cultural prophecies all have these things essentially, and it's not a starting point, it's an evolution, a moment where it begins. So there's this, they all fall within this, it seems like a 60 to 70 year range, when you project these out, and they talk about the start date, or when it starts to expand. And I feel it. I feel it. I see it. We see people using the word consciousness now openly instead of as like a nudge nudge. It used to be such a hippie word, right? And like scientists didn't even want to say the word consciousness, and now it's like everyone's talking about consciousness. Like it's the great mystery in science that we can't explain, and then it's so much bigger than that. It's the consciousness of our hearts, and where we're heading as humans.
Yeah. I, I love the way the Dalai Lama talked about this. And in one of my books, maybe a couple of them, I talk about this time that I ended up sitting next to the Dalai Lama on a 727 flying from Jammu flying from Leh Ladakh to Jammu, India. And the reason I ended up sitting next to him is because I was leading a group of people in Ladakh. And the day we were flying out, he and his entourage were also flying out. And when they walked into the airport early in the morning, we're all sitting there. He had my book Shapeshifting under his arm. And when we'd been there
That's
and
a moment.
well, when we've been in
Wow.
Ladakh, we'd send it to him by messenger, so it wasn't entirely coincidental. But as a result, I get invited to sit with him on the front seat of the plane, and I'd always heard that. And then later, he invited my whole group to spend the afternoon just with him in his living room in Dharamsala. Anyway, I'm sitting next to him, and I've heard this legend that the 14th Dalai Lama is the last, and he's the 14th. I asked him about that, and he said, "Well, I think I'm the last Dalai Lama." He said, "I don't know what that really means." He's got a great sense of humor, and he said, "But I think I may be the last Dalai Lama from the Himalayas, and maybe I'm the last Buddhist Dalai Lama." That got me, and I didn't know what to say. So I said, "Well, where do you think the next one will be from?" And he said, "Well, that's why I'm reading your book." And he said, "Because I think she or he might be a shaman from the Amazon or the Andes." I don't know.
Wow.
I think that's a possibility. And, that just really, really struck me. And then several days later, my group was of 30 people, we were with him in his living room in Dharamsala, his meeting room. It became obvious. When he walked into the room, he greeted us, and then he said, "I want to make one thing perfectly clear. Don't become a Buddhist, but do follow the Buddhist principles of compassion, cooperation, love, and he goes on with this. And then I realized what he was really saying with this business of having a shaman is that you don't need someone who's been spent his young life learning about all the different divinity, all the different spirits, the Mahakalas, the Dakinis, and so on and so forth. You don't need all that. All you need is people that really reflect the principles behind Buddhism, which are really the principles to a large degree behind most of the world's religions, if you go to the real, foundation of the religion. And so it was really interesting. So there's another prophecy, the prophecy of the 14th Dalai Lama, which he's interpreted really as meaning get someone that can bring the world together in a true way that reflects Buddhist principles, not necessarily all the Buddhist intellectual aspects of that, or for that matter, any religion.
Yeah, for me, it's I tend to tell people I lean Buddhist, which is the term I like to use. I lean Buddhist because I'm not a particular religion, and the Dalai Lama himself doesn't refer to Buddhism as a religion. I think the quote is, um, he goes, "My religion is simple. My religion is kindness." I think that was the exact quote. And he said, you don't have to be a Buddhist to practice Buddhism. You can be a Catholic, you can be a Muslim, you can be, and he lists them because it is really a life philosophy. It's a way of living,
Okay.
and it's a good way of living from my perspective. I think it's biased as I might be in that topic, but yeah, I once saw that photo of you and the Dalai Lama together, and I thought, man, John's had a very interesting life. Like,
Yeah.
would that kid back in school back in the day have thought for a moment that this would be where you would end up?
Well, that was my dream. I grew up in a boys' prep school. My dad was a teacher in a very poor town in New Hampshire, where I went to school through eighth grade, and then I went to the prep school. But so I grew up with all these very poor kids. It was a mill town where all the mills had closed, basically. But we lived on the hill where the prep school was. I was surrounded by very, very wealthy boys. And I hear all these stories about Paris and New York and London and Madrid and whatever everywhere. And I think, God, I want to go to those places. I want that life. And it was one of the things that appealed to me when I became chief economist in Economic Hitman, that I had a very large expense budget, and I flew to all these places, first class usually, and stayed in the finest hotels, wined and dined in the finest restaurants with presidents and beautiful women, and it was it seemed to be the life that I had dreamed of, and I would come to find out that it wasn't at all. It was a false dream, but
Let me
it
jump into there for a second because there was a moment in the book you talked about that in Jaguar where it felt to me like your inner compass, your soul's voice was speaking to you. And I actually have the quote with me. It's a little bit long, but I want to read the whole thing because I think it was really powerful for me when I read it. I hung out with people who supported the system who said we were doing the right thing. I wanted to hear this. I craved confirmation that I could continue making a great salary and seeing the world. However, deep down, I was miserable. I drank heavily. I slept with women I barely knew. I anesthetized myself with Valium. I was haunted by nightmares. In the mornings, I would force myself awake with overdoses of caffeine. I justified this with excuses about jet lag, but in my heart, I knew the truth. I was depressed. I hated myself. I think it's a moment a lot of us have. Maybe not that exact moment, but that moment where a deeper part of us is saying, this won't do anymore. Something needs to change.
good Lord, did I really expose myself like
Yeah,
that?
I was very impressed with the candor of that statement. It was I sat down and typed it out when I was listening to it in a book on tape, and I was like, I love this quote is amazing. I mean, that's just such an incredibly vulnerable thing to write.
Yeah.
But to me, it really was your soul or some deep compass speaking to you, saying, John, this
It's
can't continue.
very cathartic. And again, it goes back to we know as individuals that we really need to look at ourselves and find our true selves. And often that requires going against what we've been taught in school by religious figures or parents, teachers, so on, the voices that come in and say, this is what will make you happy, this is what you want to do. I had to fight that, and it becomes ingrained in you. And that's also true of the country or culture. So that's why earlier I said, I think that democracy demands that we dive deep into what we've done wrong, what our problems are, and we'll look at who are we really? What do we really want? I think the American ideal is magical, beautiful, powerful, wonderful. It's what's expressed in the Declaration of Independence and by writers back in the 1700s like Tom Paine and Thomas Jefferson and others. It's such a beautiful ideal of individuality with responsibility, individuality in support of community and family, and liberty with responsibility, and equality, opportunity. These ideals that appeal to people all around the world. we've never realized them completely here, but I think we've, for most of our history, been on an upward trajectory toward them. And, it's, but we have to dive deep. We have to really look at what's gone wrong. Why haven't we followed these ideals? Why are we attacking countries that we say are threats, but at the same time we were negotiating a peace treaty with Iran. Why would we attack it? This goes over and over and over and over. It was what I was deeply, deeply involved with was, you know, promoting a system that really doesn't work in the long term. It seems to work in the short term, but it's really only working for a few people. So why would we do that? Why would I be trained to do that? We really need to look at these things, Stacy, and that's how we get better. That's how the world gets better, and that's how we as individuals get better. That's for me to have written that, and I've written other things along those same lines. It's very cathartic. It's a very powerful way of changing to a point where now I have an amazingly beautiful life, because I'm really not making anywhere near the money I used to make at all. And I live very simply. I'm living in a pretty small house. I used to live in a big house. And I only fly to places if I'm invited to speak to people that I think were going to help change the world. So I do kind of a cost and benefit analysis. The cost of flying is more carbon dioxide and so forth. But am I going to be meeting with enough people that have the ability to really help us move into this new life economy? So anyway, I don't mean to talk so much about myself, but um, yeah.
Hey, that's what I'm here for, John. Just keep hearing more about this because your journey to me is a fascinating one. That we all have the opportunity when we get here to become the best person we can. From by the time we get to our last day, to have improved ourselves the best we can. And we are given an opportunity to do that every day, and some of us we neglect that, and we take what we think is the easy road while our soul is screaming out, "This doesn't work." And others, they make changes along the way and see how they can leave the world a little bit better place. And your journey is fascinating because like you said, you started in this boys' school and you saw the golden shiny things and you're like, I want some of that. And you went and you got it. But really your legacy isn't that you were a successful guy in that. It's that you're a successful guy and have been and continue to be a successful guy and making changes that will affect the world long term. I mean, that's an amazing thing that I'm sure as a schoolboy you didn't see coming.
Yeah, no, I guess not. Although I was steeped by my mom in reading Tom Paine and the Declaration, and there was this. I had a very strong background in deep, deep respect for the original visionaries of the American dream.
Is that the book Common Sense?
Yeah, Common Sense by Tom Paine and The American Crisis by Tom Paine and others, and just they were just magnificent things that writings that came out of that period. But it's continued from there've been many other writers since then that have expounded upon this, guys like Thoreau and Emerson and many others. But and I was steeped in that. So from an early age, I had this sense that what there is something out there that's better. But then when I got drafted into this consulting firm as an economist, again, they played upon that, and the whole system plays upon that to say, yes, that's what we're doing, by extracting more resources. You know, there are winners and losers, and you want to be a winner, to live that dream for you. It's about you living that dream. In indigenous communities, it's about the community. There's a belief that, traditionally, these things are changing as civilization comes in. But when I lived with the Shuar and the Atwa, the idea was that if anybody's suffering in the community needlessly, in other words, you may be suffering from a broken leg or some disease that nobody can fix, but if anybody's suffering from lack of food, shelter, or love, the whole community is suffering. So we need to make sure that this person's taken care of. Yeah, that's part of what I call the life economy, this understanding that the community is everything. It's beyond the individual. And yes, we need to, as individuals, we need to look at ourselves and see what is it that we can do best and enjoy doing. Like for me, writing and not being an economist, not going out and exploiting the world, but trying to make the world a better place, to create a life, to transform the death economy to a life economy. So, how do we do that? And that's typically not part of our education, unfortunately.
You say the first step towards that on an individual basis is just awareness and just like the choices you're talking about,
In my more recent books, including the one that comes out in September, um, I suggest to people that they ask themselves 5 questions that are all based on the individual, because let's face it, we can all take different paths, but if we have the same destination of a life economy, we'll get there. So the 5 questions are: one, what do I most want to do for the rest of my life? What will bring me the greatest satisfaction? Because if we don't do what we most want to do in our lives, we'll never be successful. We might make a lot of money, as I did as an economic hitman, but living off Valium and alcohol. The second question is, how can I do this in a way that transforms the death economy to a life economy? So for the first question, I would answer, I want to write. I love to write. My carpenter friend, as I mentioned earlier, would say, well, I want to work with my hands in wood. The second question is, how do I do this in a way that transforms the death economy to a life economy? I'm going to write about these things. I'm going to try to inspire people through my writing. My carpenter friend would say, well, I'm going to use only sustainable materials and plant trees. And the third question is, what's keeping me? What's holding me back? The Schwa would say, what's the jaguar standing in my trail? That's where the idea of touching the jaguar comes, because they say when something's holding you back, it's usually it's something somebody else has planted in your head. And if you run from it, it'll chase you for the rest of your life. But if you touch it, if you really confront it, if you face it, it'll give you the power to change your perception. And when you change your perception, you change your reality. And so the third question, what's holding me back? So as a writer, I might say, well, I had an English teacher that said I was that criticized my writing. So I'm not good enough. And my carpenter friend might say, my clients don't want to pay the extra price for sustainable materials. And so then the fourth question is, when you touch that jaguar, how does it change your perception? And for me, I had realized, well, my English teacher never published anything. What did he know about a writer? And some of the greatest writers in the world never had much of an education at all, formally speaking. And my carpenter friend would say, well, I have to tell my clients that if there's an extra price, it's not a cost, it's an investment. And then the fifth question is, what actions do I take immediately and keep taking? And so those 5 questions, what do I most want to do for the rest of my life? How do I do this in a way that transforms the death economy to a life economy? What's stopping me? And when I touch that perception of what's stopping me, how do I change the perception? And then what actions do I take? And these are incidentally outlined in my next book, as well as in my most recent book, the third edition of Confessions. But I think, we can all look at those questions. And often the first and second question may remain the same for a long time at least, but the third, fourth, and fifth question will change frequently as we resolve one of these issues, as we touch one of these jaguars, like my teacher said I was a lousy writer. We touch that and get beyond that. Then I got to touch another question, which is, what am I going to write about? And then another question is, what's the first sentence? And so on and so forth. So we can go through that. I actually suggest to people to do what I do, which is most mornings. I wake up in the morning, and for just a minute, I can ask myself those 5 questions and plot out the rest of my day as a result.
Yeah, I think a lot of people in that list, you get to number three, and number three is really about fear. Like it's the stories we tell ourselves, and it's pushing through that before you can even get an opportunity to touch the jaguar. You have to first get through that fear, the story. And we all have that. I deal with that all the time with this, with my writing, with, whatever stories I'm telling myself. And we we do it so reflexively we don't notice unless we're being actively intentional about it. I love
That's
this list. I'm going to have to share this in the show notes for those of you who don't have a pen. I'll make sure I list these for you so you can copy them.
And that is the important thing, what you identified is having the intent of touching it. Yes, we all have those things and we keep having them and they help us as long as we identify them. They're there for us as long as we identify them. Because when you identify them and you touch them, they give you power. They give you energy. They give you creativeness, creativity, whatever the right word is. Anyway, so it's not a they're not bad things. They're there. They're only bad if they stop you from doing what you most want to do. But all of our emotions are just energy. So I'm angry. I'm really, really angry. But that's energy. And I used to use that anger in destructive ways. There was a time when I was resisting wars by throwing bottles at windows and getting arrested and trampled by policemen on horses. But that's how I acted then. But now I'm still angry. I'm angry at corporations. I'm angry at what we're doing in the world. And I'm having a lot of fun with it. I write about it every day. I talk to you. This is fun. I'm still angry. The anger is there, but it's how we use our emotions. What do we do with them? What do
Channeling
we,
your emotions for good.
yes,
All
yes.
right. You just moved my needle just a little bit with that one where like I don't watch the news because it frustrates me so much and I feel so powerless. But if you can take that feeling of powerless, that's an emotion, and move it towards trying to change the world, something good comes from it if enough of us do that, I suppose.
Yeah.
We could only hope.
Well, absolutely. It will happen. If critical mass of us does this and does it in a way where we're having fun, where we're doing what we most want to do, because burnout is
Perhaps
terrible.
that's a key ingredient, the having fun thing. And I didn't think about that, but that's what we do here.
Yeah,
I try to enjoy myself while I'm talking about the good things in the world and how to find a more joyful life.
exactly. Do what you most want to do and do it with joyously. I'd love to write, and there are aspects that I don't like as much as other ones, like some of the editing and then some of the marketing of a book and so on and so forth. It's kind of like, you have a good dinner. You gotta wash the dishes, or at least rinse them off and put them in the dishwasher.
It's a good analogy.
But then you learn to have fun doing that. It's a meditation, right? It's meditation. And so, yeah, burnout is, the four pillars that I talk about in my upcoming book are fear, debt, anxiety over scarcity, and divide and conquer. Those are four pillars that throughout history have been used by economic hitmen and are being very, very successfully used right now against us here in America. In my day, we use them, to exploit other countries. Today, they're actually being used to exploit us too. And you mentioned fear. That's the first one. That's one of them, but it's
That's the
only
big
one.
one.
It's a big one, but they're all big. When you come down to them, they're all interrelated. And so yeah, the fear is there, but it's often driven by this anxiety over scarcity. Oh, if I do what I most want to do, if I just devote myself to writing, I'm not going to have any money, And if I don't have any money, I'm going to lose my house. I've got a mortgage on my house. If I lose my house, my spouse will leave me. My children will abandon me. You just keep going with this. So that's fear, but it's based on anxiety over scarcity and and debt. Oh, I'm indebted. I'm indebted to somebody. It's not always money debt, but I'm indebted. Oh, I can't do this because I'm indebted to somebody. I owe somebody else this job or whatever. They're all, and a divide and conquer, that's one that's being used extremely effectively in the United States right now. We're so divided. It's terribly sad, but it gives the people in power more power on both sides. When there's division, the people up here gain from the division.
Yep.
And however, who can use it most effectively, this division, right or left, who's most effective at that? We're seeing this now, right now, you don't listen. I listen to NPR every morning, and it's like, yeah, yeah, yeah. There's a swing from right. from pro-Trump to increasing swing to left to anti-Trump, and then there's a swing back, and the stock market's doing this, and now it's doing that, and things keep swinging this way and that way. So it's how do you find that balance in between? But the divide and conquer is right there, and it's very, very dangerous. It's why Africa is the wealthiest continent in the world, resource-wise, and the poorest from a people standpoint, because the colonial powers were so effective at dividing and conquering Africa, and now the internal leaders who learned from the colonial powers are colonizing their own people the same way, the divide and conquer. That's another whole subject. I'm sorry to get off on that, but it's I
No,
just
not at all. It reminds me of what you had described colonization to someone on another show that I had listened to, another podcast. Forget which one it was, and it was such a brilliant description of what colonization is. Actually, you know what? I think it was in Jaguar. It was someone in the back of the bus when you were talking about colonization, when you were at the large hydroelectric dam that you had been involved in doing the planning for, asked what how you define empire and colonization, and you would describe that so well in the book. So again, anyone who wants to read that, definitely pick up the book. And it was it something clicked in me that helped me understand it in a way that I hadn't before. And like you understood exactly what you're talking about. You had thought about this, and yeah, it was a brilliant way to look at it because it definitely moved the needle in the way I saw things when I read that, or more accurately, listened to the book on tape. Great book on tape.
Mhm.
You know, I was thinking about the spiritual aspect of your journey. Um, you've you've had uh, so you had these really amazing shaman that you came in contact with. Maria was one. Can we say the name? How do you pronounce the name of your first shaman?
Well, in the early books, the shaman books, I changed the name because I was afraid that they would get injured as a
Oh,
result.
right. Okay. I just wanted to just
But I'm not
if
sure which one you're referring to, but the shaman Chumbi, is that who you're referring to? CHU?
no, that wasn't the one that I was thinking of, but I just primarily wanted to speak their name out of respect. But if the name was changed, it doesn't matter. Well, the bigger point is that
In the later books, I used their real name because shamanism became acceptable, and
yeah,
then
I know there was a risk that was taken with that first shaman just treating you because if something happened to you, then a large price could be paid for that by all the people there. Um, but I found it fascinating that as you were moving forward, even in this, world where you're wearing a buttoned up suit and a nice tie and, flying on nice airplanes, staying in nice hotels, you were intentionally carving out time and secretly seeking out shamans in other parts of the world to study with. That's that was to me very fascinating. You want to talk a little bit more about that?
yeah, because the shaman who saved my life when I was a Peace Corps volunteer in 1968, 69. Then, as payment for saving my life, and this was on an ayahuasca journey that he did it, and I truly was dying. I'm a 3-day terribly difficult hike from the nearest medical facility, and I'm flat on my back. I can't stand up, so there's no way I can get to a medical facility. So the shaman then gives me ayahuasca, takes me through the ceremony, saves my life. And then as a result, and I get better almost immediately. So yes, he saved my life. And I could now stand up and do everything. And he required that I become his apprentice. He'd had this vision of an outsider being his apprentice. And so uh, I'm lost. What is the
I,
question?
I'm curious how that experience informed your decision to seek out other shamans as well and become a student of shamanism worldwide.
So I studied under him for over a year in under the Schwa way, which involves a lot of plant uses of different plants in plant medicine. And also, it's always a spiritual connection with the plants. It isn't about the chemistry of the plants to them. It's about the connecting with the spirit, which takes time to really get into it. That plant right behind you is great spirit. You can connect with that, and you probably have. It's beautiful. And then I spent so it was 2 years in the Peace Corps. I was really working with the Schwa, and then when I extended a third year, the Peace Corps transferred me up until the to the Andes, where I was working with the Quechua people. I studied with their shamans because I'd become really fascinated by this, and that there was interchange between those two groups to some degree. And then as I traveled around the world, in Iran, I connected with a Bedouin shaman, and also in Egypt and in Indonesia, these connections with the Boogie shamans in Indonesia, and on and on, because it just really interested me. But it had to be secret, because if the people I worked with, people at the World Bank or at my own company, had, that to them was at that time, total woo-woo, new age, crazy stuff. Witch doctors, who, you don't believe in witch doctors. We we hanged witches in this country back not too long
Mm.
ago. So I had to keep it as a secret, and of course that's not true anymore, fortunately. And I've been invited to speak about some of these things at places like the World Bank, and it's that's part of the shift, the Pachacuti. It's part of the prophecy of the eagle and the condor. Now I take groups in to study with some of these shamans to learn from them, small groups periodically, and I've taken executives from oil companies and others, and it's changed them. And some of them end up quitting their jobs as a result, or trying to do better work and getting fired.
Mm.
We've gone through all sorts of things on this level, but it's yeah.
That's amazing. What an amazing result.
Well, yes, but I have to say, it's it's been interesting to watch, excuse me, the reactions to the institutions where some of these people work when they go back and try to implement some of the things. And I advise them strongly to be careful. I was speaking at a university in Southern California recently, and at the end I do questions and answers, and this guy raises his hand and he says, "Well, I'm an economics professor here. I'm a business professor here." And I realized that for the last 10 years I've been teaching my students how to excel in the death economy. And now I didn't even realize that until today. You identified it. What do you suggest I do now that I know this? And I said, well, first of all, don't lose your job, you know, uh, but subtly encourage them to invest in as they go into business, to invest in the life economy, to move their businesses increasingly, whatever their acumen is, their skill set, use it to move into a life economy. And these things can't be done like that. It's like, well, we can't get off fossil fuels like that. You just can't do it. On the other hand, what we're doing right now is regressing to more fossil fuels, unfortunately. That's ridiculous. But so the real process would be one that we're starting to go through, where increasingly you're moving away from fossil fuels into solar and wind and other alternatives. Uh, these things don't happen immediately, but when you think of human life, but 10 years ago, solar and wind were not economical, or they were just beginning to get economical. Now they're extremely economical. So that's 10 years is nothing in history. That's a blink of an eye, not even a blink of an eye, historically speaking. So we move things in these directions, and so with this professor, and I've said this is just one example. Yeah, yeah, hang in there. I've said this to people at the World Bank. Do everything you can to promote change, but it's not like saying, well, I don't want to teach here anymore. I'm not going to teach economics anymore, or I'm not going to stay with the World Bank anymore. It's like, yeah, but I'm going to do it in a way where I will continually promote the transformation from a death to a life economy while keeping my job.
Now, do you
And
get the sense that some folks at the World Bank's hearts are changing, that they're
oh,
tending to?
absolutely. I was invited to speak there not too long ago in Washington at their headquarters, and I got there a little early. I went into their bookstore, and I was shocked to see that there was this bookcase that had their 10 best-selling books, and mine was number 4, Confessions
Oh,
of an
wow.
Economic Hitman. it blew my mind, and I asked the guy, and he brought out the manager. He says, I don't know why. And he brought out the manager, and I asked the manager, I said, I'm surprised you even sell this book here. And he said, well, we sell whatever our people ask for. And they asked for this book. They love this book. It's very, very popular.
Oh,
And,
wow.
yeah, it was, and then I gave this speech, and afterwards I was approached by several young people who had just started working, had just been working at the World Bank for maybe a year or so, and they asked me if I'd go out to dinner with about a dozen of them, the newbies. And I did, and they all that came that expressed anything expressed deep frustration. They said, we came to
Mhm.
this organization because we wanted to do good, and now we're understanding that we're doing what you've described. What do you suggest? And I said, well, don't just up and quit. Try to change the system. And you might go so far that they'll fire you. Well, then you can make a big case out of that. You can take that to court if they fire you. They got to have cause. But otherwise, just keep pushing for change. But do it in a way where it can actually be effective. That's
So
that's
you believe you still believe change can happen from the inside.
I think it has to happen from the inside as well as the outside. It has to happen from both. It has to, and it always has, historically speaking. And yeah, that's always been part of our history. It
I
wasn't.
asked the question that way because your story is that part of your story is that you were on the inside and you were like, I think if I stay, I can make a change from the inside, and but you described yourself as a man with a foot in two worlds because you're straddling that,
Yeah.
and I felt like you got the sense that when you were done, it was really hard to make that change in your case.
Yes, and it ultimately, for my own well-being, I had to get out. And that's the other thing I tell people. If it's damaging you, if it's keeping you, if you're living on Valium and alcohol, get out. But and that's the other part of it that's very, very important. But I still feel that I'm working from the inside. I'm speaking at big events, of big corporate events, and uh, I recently did a big program for HP, which was formerly Hewlett Packard, and other corporations. So I, you know, what I find interesting about all this is that business people understand it. I'm asked to speak at business schools, like the one in Southern California, and they're understanding it, and they're wanting to understand it. And again, the status quo, the president of the university or the head of the economics department may object to this, but um, that's the pushback. But the students are getting it. People are getting it. I also just recently spoke at Princeton last month. And I was speaking to a large group of people that were all, one way or another, connected either in studying economics or business or China. And I was speaking about my most recent book, which discusses the most recent one that's already out there, uh, China's economic hitman policy. So, I was invited to Princeton to speak about these things to students that are growing up to be part of that system and want to understand how can we bring China and the United States together to produce a global life economy. That was the subject of my talk. And it was the hall was standing room only. I mean, there were a lot of young scholars, young, students there, and some professors too. Um, so people are getting it. There really is a consciousness change that's going on and a pushback against it also.
It's amazing that you're seeing that in real time, because usually it's only when we look back that we can see the change that happened. But I'm feeling it as well. And it's amazing how many people I talk to on this show and in my personal life that, there's something about the consciousness shift that's happening that it's, I'm excited and heartened to hear you say that because I have a perception of what's going on in the colleges, and that's a really good sign, I think, what you're talking about.
Yeah, yeah. I have a grandson who's 18, has just been accepted at Berkeley and also the University of Washington Foster Business School. And, he went to the Amazon with me in January, where I took a film crew of about 10 to this film company that's doing a documentary about my life. And they began about 3 years ago. And this was kind of the final shoot, was to go deep in the Amazon with me and my grandson. And he's so he's in senior in high school. He's had his own very successful business here, and I keep encouraging him, yeah, get out there, be a successful businessman in the life economy, you know and so that's the fun, that's the challenge and the fun. And I'm going to have to get off in the next 4 or 5 minutes,
Yeah, I
Stacy.
was going to say, out of respect to your time, I know we're coming up at the top of the hour, so we should
Yeah,
shift here. And I'd like to just thank you again for being here, John. This has been a while. I'm a smaller show, so it means a lot to me that you were willing to come on and spend some time with us, and talk with the people that come to the Soul Podcast to get tools for a joyful life. And this is one of those wonderful tools for a joyful life. Is like the more you do with meaning and purpose in your day, the more joyful your days are. And if that also makes the world a better place, then you've got a double whammy there. I'm going to share the links to Economic Hitman and Jaguar in the show notes, as well as some others. Anybody who wants to pick up those books, I highly recommend both of them. Read them in either order. It doesn't really matter. If you do buy them, use the links in the show notes. They're the same price you would pay, but a portion of the proceeds help support the show. John, again, any last thoughts before we go?
yeah, thanks, Stacy. I think the last thoughts would be to tell all your listeners that you're really blessed. We are all blessed to be alive at this time. It's, we're living a major event in history. This time is not a footnote in history. There's a huge consciousness change going on, and there needs to be. We've reached this point. And so really honor the fact that you were born now into this time, and you have a role to play in making this transition from the death economy to a life economy. You have a role to play. Don't be afraid of it. Move into it. Touch that jaguar and enjoy it. Have fun with it. This is a fun time to be alive. Challenging, with tremendous opportunities, and the greatest opportunity to really enjoy being part of this phenomenal era of transformation.
Thank you, John. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you, Stacy. Keep up your great work. The size of the audience doesn't matter. It's who the audience is. And I've discovered that, you can be talking to, I can be talking to a couple of thousand people, and maybe nobody out there is going to end up doing anything. Who knows? Or I might be talking to 25 people, and one of them might do something really big.
Yeah, I was thinking about your life and the ripple effects. I suppose the same is true for me, but it's harder to see. So
Yeah,
thanks for that. And again, I know you're up against the hour, so I appreciate it, and I'll let you go. Hopefully, we'll have an opportunity to talk again sometime, or I'll be able to see you next time you speak near me.
great. Let's do it. Keep up
All
your
right.
great work, Stacy. I very much appreciate what you're doing.
Thank you,
Thank you.
John. I'll send you a link when this airs.
Thank you.